Hello and welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One here on the Overtime Media Network. Mark and Mark, Daly and Hamilton kicking off the very first race of the 2021 Formula One World Championship. And Mark, where did that winter go? It feels like it wasn't all that long ago since we were in Abu Dhabi, wrapping up the season at Yas Marina. And here we are just only a couple of months later. And it's weird. I was thinking today that we've technically already lost a race, what with the rescheduling of the Australian Grand Prix to later into the year. But I don't actually feel like it's affected the start of the season. We're about, I guess, about 10 days, maybe 2 weeks behind where the typical start of the season. But I'm amped up. I'm ready to go. By the time everybody's downloaded and listened to the show or started to, we'll have FP1 in the bag. About 7 hours away as we sit down to record this on Thursday night, March 25th. And I'm ready to go. I'm ready to sit down, plant myself in front of the TV, even though there's a couple of days to go, even before the action on the track starts in earnest for qualifying and the race on Sunday. It's great. I'm totally pumped for this one.
I got to say, I'm a bit of a social media fiend, and over probably the last 10 years, I've paid particular attention to Formula One and how Formula One trends on social media. And I got to say that I haven't seen so much pent-up interest in a forthcoming campaign as this one since probably, I don't know, 2010, 2011. I've never seen anything quite like this during the Mercedes era, and I think it's exciting. And I think Formula One is going to post blockbuster numbers this year. I think they're going to see a huge surge of subscribers for the F1 TV Pro app. I think a lot of their traditional free-to-air TV providers are going to see bonkers numbers. I'm excited for all the reasons that we talked about, and not just because I'm being an F1 homer. I just think there's a lot of reasons to be excited. We could potentially see parity this year. It's the last year of the current era. There's all kinds of interesting narratives. There's driver switches to fundamentally new teams. There's so much to talk about. And you're totally right. Like, I can't wrap my head around the fact that we should be bracing ourselves for the second race weekend of the year, not the first. And it still feels like a compressed off season. You know what I mean? Because the season was lengthened. Like, it's crazy. It's crazy. So I echo all of your sentiments in terms of excitement.
Yeah, it's just this is the best part. I can't wait to get back to racing. And I could go on about that at length, but before we get into it, I want to get into the mailbag tonight. And we had a nice email from John Campbell checking in from Philadelphia. I wonder if he's West Philadelphia born and raised.
Come on. Come on. You're better than that.
No, I'm not. But anyways, a really nice message from John. He said, I'm very much in the Drive to Survive generation of F1 fans. I now have an F1 TV subscription, which includes an archive of races. What are some of the classic Grand Prix that you recommend to newer fans like me? So I've got a couple that I sent back to John. He's subsequently checked in and he's watched one of them. I'm going to just throw it to you, and because we haven't talked about this since we got the message. I just want to see you'll pick 3 races out of all the years you've watched F1 that you would say, someone like John, who's asked you, if you had to give me your top 3 races to watch, which ones would you pick?
Hold on. I'm definitely not on the app right now trying to figure this out.
The people on YouTube can actually see that, Mark.
Yeah, I realize that now. I'm not being super discreet. I still have a soft spot for Abu Dhabi in 2016. I thought it wasn't exactly the frantic finish, but it was great to see a championship come down to the last race. I loved Abu Dhabi in 2014 because the championship did come down to the last race and it was a double points finish, which has since been scrapped. I loved Silverstone in 2018. I loved Spain in 2016. I didn't really love much between 2010 and 2013. I loved, obviously, Brazil in 2008. I thought that was a blockbuster. And I don't know if that's on the app itself, but that was the race that Hamilton came from deep in the back of the field to secure enough points to take the championship after Felipe Massa was celebrating with Ferrari, thinking he'd won. I thought that was a great race. I think those would be the top ones for me. And if you went back to the 90s, obviously, and I can't remember which race it was, and I feel like an idiot, but obviously that race where Michael Schumacher created intentional conflict with Jacques Villeneuve in the hope of taking him out of the title race, which Jacques ultimately won.
Jerez?
Jerez in Spain.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
I think that was.
Yep, that was a good one. But yeah, those are some good ones. Absolutely. And by the way, I know he noted in the email as well, hey, you guys, I know you don't really do a mailbag segment. We would love to do a mailbag segment. Send us more emails. If people send us emails, I promise you we will talk about them on the air.
Absolutely. Yeah, we get emails, just not frequently enough to make it a regular segment. So absolutely send them in. We'll pick the best ones and read them out. And we all know that they're going to be good. So anyways, you actually took two of my choices. I put down Abu Dhabi 2016 because same thing, was down to the wire. And it got I think I haven't gone back and watched it subsequently, but from my recollection, that race felt like it got more intense as it went on, and Lewis was slowing down. He was intentionally backing Nico into Max Verstappen and Sebastian Vettel, who were running third and fourth, who were deliberately trying to keep the two Mercedes cars at arm's length and not try and get involved in that. So that was one. I picked Brazil 2008 for the same reasons, because Felipe was world champion for like what, 20 seconds or
20
something.
seconds.
It was, I mean, he technically was world champion until Lewis crossed over the finish line. So that was another one. And then I picked three races from the 90s. Oh, sorry, actually two from the 90s, one from the 80s, going all the way back to when I first got into it when I was a kid. I picked Belgium 98 because that was that famous wet race at Spa when half of the field basically disintegrated on that first corner turning into La Source. That was also the same one where Michael Schumacher ripped off the right-hand side of his car when he plowed into David Coulthard, who was touring around, after his car was having mechanical problems. I picked Britain 92 because that was the dominant year of Nigel Mansell's World Championship and the Williams FW15B. Still one of the most amazing Formula One cars ever built, with that had a lot of the technologies where they pioneered it. It had ABS, traction control, the active suspension, which subsequently got banned. A lot of these really set the groundwork for that one. And then Japan 1998, which was another title decider. And you think that it was bad between Rosberg and Hamilton. Senna and Prost did that originally, and they did it way more intense and bitter and nasty. And that's the race where they both came together in that chicane right before the pit straight at Suzuka. So those were that. And then if you're a new fan, if you're a Gen DTSer who's just checking in for this year, you've just watched season 3 and you think Formula One is something that you'd like to see more, go back and just in recent history check out Italy 2019. Charles Leclerc fighting off the two Mercedes cars for basically the entire year, and that really shows us some of the excitement and the passion, especially from the Tifosi, from the Italian, the Ferrari fans. I think that's a real good one to go check out if you're brand new to the sport. So
total self-promotion. If you do watch the 2016 Abu Dhabi race, I feature throughout. Look for me. I am immediately adjacent the starting 2 slots on the grid in the grandstand, wearing a yellow Mercedes hat and a black Mercedes t-shirt, wearing a Canada flag as a cape. And you can also see me. You can also see me throughout the podium celebration. So actually, I might send some screenshots. Just total self-promotion. Total self-promotion. I will say though that stupidly, my wife and I were so eager to get on the track to watch the podium celebration. We left the grandstand before Rosberg had actually crossed the finish line and won the Grand Prix. So we actually missed the moment he crossed the finish line to win the race and started doing donuts. We missed all of that. We're standing behind a fence waiting to get onto the track. So again, total hindsight's 2020. But yeah, I'll post a screenshot on the Twitter just so you can see. But those are some great call outs.
I was just going to say, pictures where it didn't happen, but obviously you have no scruples and you're going to do it anyway. So, all right, well, let's get into the show. What we're going to do is we've each picked a couple of storylines that we're really interested in that we're going to follow throughout the year. Later in the show, we're going to talk about just go over some of the some of the highlights, some of the previous Grand Prix that we've seen at Sakir. I mean, it actually doesn't feel like so long since the last one, and it wasn't really, because we had that back-to-back race weekends there just at the latter end of last year, where we had Bahrain proper, the Grosjean race, and then also the Bahrain outer circuit, which I thought was awesome. When you look at the track map and you see the circuit layout and you see how that outer ring goes at Bahrain, I thought it was really cool. I mean, they were lapping in 55, 56 seconds or something like that, but it was certainly very cool. And it's great to get back. I mean, I guess for the bubble's sake, it works pretty good for the pandemic measures and everything. Keep them all in Bahrain, keep them all on the at the track, hopefully. And it'll be great to get going. So, Mark, why don't we pick? Let's start with you. We got about 5 minutes before we head into the first break here. So let's take your first story in no particular order. What are one of the things that you're going to be looking at for this year? What's your big storyline?
Yeah, so one of them, and I don't know if this is going to appeal to a ton of our listeners, so we probably get this one out of the way right away, but CanCon. So here in Canada, we have this concept called Canadian content, and historically, the Canadian government has regulated how much Canadian content has to be aired on TV and radio because we have to be able to protect Canadian culture, blah, 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 blah. So I kind of want to talk about the Canadian drivers in F1. And for me, that's a big storyline this year. And I'm actually going to reframe this segment and just say, I'm going to talk about the North American-based drivers in F1 to broaden the appeal to our American listeners, who I think you said represent about 50% of our listener base.
Yeah,
so
it's amazing. Yep.
We have two North American drivers. We have Nicholas Latifi, who's coming out of a rookie season with Williams, and we have Lance Stroll, who's going into year number 4, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So year number 5, which is absolutely remarkable. Both of them are obviously well-funded. They both come from wealthy families. They're both phenomenal guys, great personalities, super charismatic. I think Lance, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later, so I'm less concerned about him in terms of this segment. Obviously, he's had a relatively interesting career. He's shown flashes of brilliance with flashes of mediocrity. He's had some reliability issues. He came into the championship in 17 after winning F3. He really struggled initially to come to grips with the car and the balance and the tires. Ultimately gets a podium in year 1. So last year, I think this is kind of where I want to focus this one. I think one of the big storylines for me that I'm going to be really interested in is Nicholas Latifi. And I think last year, a lot of people wrote him off simply because he was a Williams driver that underperformed relative to George Russell. And I think a couple of things that were in his favor. If you look at his performance last year, he was remarkably consistent. Now, he was terrible in qualifying. And I think if you look at any of his kind of interviews over the last month, he's acknowledged that. But this was a guy that didn't make mistakes on track because he literally couldn't afford to in that car because the team didn't have the money to rebuild it. I think he probably went 7 or 8 races to start the season without a retirement, which is remarkable for any rookie driver. Now, he is a little bit older, but I think one of the storylines for me is he's going to be in an improved car this year. They're bringing over the Mercedes gearbox, and Williams has always been ferociously independent when it comes to the gearbox. So they're going to pair that Mercedes gearbox with the Mercedes power unit. It should be a better package. I am incredibly interested to see how he performs. He has a phenomenal benchmark in George Russell driving the exact same car. I think for him, his reliability was great last year. His maturity was very good. He has to be better at qualifying. He has to start outperforming George Russell in qualifying, and he's got to be able to secure some points this year because I don't know that he's guaranteed a seat beyond this year, regardless about the amount of money that his family's bringing to the team. But I think he could make a leap. But I think he has this fantastic benchmark in George Russell, and I'm dying to see how that storyline plays out, largely because, one, I know the guy. I've spoken to him many times. He's a great guy. He's a great Canadian. He reps the 6. He reps Canada. But that's a storyline that I'm incredibly fascinated in.
Yeah, there's a couple of points I want to touch on here, and I love how you kind of broadened it out to the North American Lance and Nicholas. But the one thing that I find absolutely fascinating is when you think about it, you have just literally miles from where we're sitting right now. You have the 49th parallel. We got the border with the United States. Massive country, big population, massive economy, and yet it would appear that there is not a Formula One level caliber driver from the United States with the funding, not necessarily as a pay driver, but you would just think on just the size and the population, everything that the USA has going for them, that one driver does not. And this is not like something new. This is something that's gone on for many, many, many years, that there has not been an American driver in Formula One. Hopefully that changes soon, but that I just find is a phenomena that is just it boggles the mind. It really does. But just going back to your points about George Russell and Nicholas Latifi, I think it's interesting too. If you look at George, 23, he's been in the sport for a couple of years now with Williams. Obviously had that fantastic race last year when he filled in for Lewis Hamilton when he was out with COVID. And what he did in that Mercedes that one weekend in Bahrain was spectacular. It's funny. He's 23. Nick is 25. He's actually older than I think. And I totally agree with you. I think this could potentially be a make or break year for him, because I mean, he struggled in his rookie season. Now he's a sophomore. He should know better. I mean, obviously the car wasn't great. I mean, there's a steep learning curve in 2020, and just obviously not made any easier just with all the difficulties of having to compete in a pandemic environment and all that. So that's difficult. And Lance too. I mean, we've talked quite a bit about Lance. I mean, we have done for years for obvious reason. I mean, like you say, he's going into season 5, but also it is interesting because I mean, theoretically we're expecting and hoping that we're going to see Aston Martin make a leap forward this year. I mean, whether or not that translates into reality or not, but it really is interesting to see. I mean, he's had some sniffs at success. I mean, there's definitely been something showing there. I mean, out of the two, I mean, Lance looks, he's much further ahead in terms of his development as a driver, his racecraft and everything compared to Nicholas Latifi, which you would expect from a guy that's already been in the sports, the sport for several years. And of course, he's got, a big, I wouldn't say ego, but a big person beside him in the garage, and 4-time world champion Sebastian Vettel. We know that Lance is soaking up everything he possibly can from Seb at the moment in terms of learning how to be a better race driver. And just some of the quotes that Lance has been making over the past couple of weeks has been interesting, just watching Sebastian operate within the team, the feedback he's been giving, from testing just about the car and things like that. So Lance is definitely going to benefit from that. And I think certainly that, once we get a couple more races under our belt here too, I think that influence of having a multiple world champion as your teammate, so regardless if the team is competitive or they're struggling a little bit, I think Lance is going to definitely learn. I hope based on what we saw in 2020 with Racing Points, that they can carry that momentum forward under this new guise as Aston Martin, and we'll just have to wait and see. But yeah, two very, very interesting situations, and I'll just talk about it. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about was just the changing demographics. I mean, you have the grid is basically split. Well, there's 7 drivers over 30 and 13 drivers under 30. So that was one of the ones I wanted to talk about. And I just noticed what the time is at. So before we launch into the next one, we're going to take a very quick break here on the Overtime Media Network, and we will come back and kick it off. I want to talk about the big 3 teams and what their chances of success will be. We'll do that in just a moment. So don't go away. We'll be right back. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. And thank you all for listening. For all of you checking out the show on YouTube, exciting times. We've got the first race of the season coming up just literally in a matter of hours now as free practice gets underway at Sakir for the Bahrain Grand Prix. Been going since 2004. It doesn't seem like that long, but again, it does. Anyways, I hinted at it just before the break, Mark, and there's a lot of things. We could probably break it down into a detailed analysis of all 3 of the top 3 teams, but I'm really interested to see where these teams are going, because I mean, for the past several years, it was obviously Mercedes, then Ferrari, and then Red Bull was kind of close, but not quite close enough. And then we've kind of seen that dynamic change. Obviously, Ferrari dropped off the pace in 2019. Last year, they were nowhere to be seen. Red Bull, but before that, they were closing the gap and actually gotten in front of them, even before this whole engine controversy in 2019. That was already changing that dynamic. And now, just to kind of shake it up even more, Red Bull has added Sergio Perez, so they get a very strong driver lineup, with Max and with Sergio going into this year. It appears they're throwing everything at it. The Honda Power Unit that this last year, that they're going to be officially in F1 before they get rebranded and taken over and become wholly a Red Bull engine, which is exciting. But then just the other wrinkle, I mean, there's so many twists and turns to this story, is the apparent really sluggish start to the season that Mercedes had by really underperforming and having some pretty major issues with the W12 that we saw in winter testing just a couple of weeks ago. And it's that's the big question. I mean, you see Mercedes struggling. Ferrari says that the straight line speed that was such a big issue in their Achilles heel last year is no longer an issue. And then you have Red Bull saying that this is the best preseason that they've ever had. They topped the time charts in Bahrain for the winter test, and that's really fascinating because let's face it, Mercedes, one of the key reasons that they've won so many titles is that they, right from the very first race of the year, they've come out running, and in many years they've just built up this massive bank of points over the first number of races, that they are just a dot so far down the road before you even get to the European part of the season. By the time you get to races like Baku, by the time you get to races like Barcelona, they've built up such a gap, a lead in the championships. It's almost insurmountable.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the big takeaways that I had from winter testing this year is, and I think I said this last week, but I don't put a ton of stock into long form speed. I don't put a ton of time into, I don't put a ton of stock into their sector times. Like for me, winter testing is more just about reliability and pace and consistency and the number of laps the drivers get in the cars. That said, Red Bull put in some terrific times, but they also showed a tremendous amount of reliability. Sergio Perez was supremely comfortable in a car that he's never driven in a meaningful way before. There was a lot of stuff that was going really well for Red Bull. And despite the fact that this year's Mercedes incarnation is very much last year's car, they looked very uncomfortable. That they weren't setting, and I shouldn't say they weren't setting great times, they were setting good times. But ultimately, Hamilton spun twice. The back end seemed really, really inconsistent. Like there's a lot of reasons to suggest that maybe at least the beginning of the season will be different than what we've seen in the past. Because you're right, like in the past, you could rely on Mercedes to bank a ton of points in the first quarter of the season and the championship to be done. And then for me, emotionally, like how do I stay motivated to keep watching through the back half of the season? I'm hoping that maybe the beginning of the season especially is different, because if Mercedes is on the back heel, maybe there's some tension introduced and it drives some additional interest, and maybe that's a good thing. And I would also love to see Hamilton, and we saw this in 2016, I get it, but I would also love to see him chasing a championship leader as well, rather than just setting the pace and comfortably leading the championship. I love all those points. And I think, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago, especially, which was Ferrari looked good. They don't look great, but it looks like they've got a significant amount of that performance back that they artificially lost last year. And that could make them a contender, because as bad as they were last year, Leclerc still had a couple of podiums. Like the car wasn't fundamentally broken, and they contest that they fixed the drag issue, and they contest that they've made up that power delta. So I think this is a great talking point, and it's going to be very, very fascinating to watch.
Well, especially like if we go into the first couple of races of the year, let's just say, for example, Max Verstappen wins in Bahrain. He wins at Imola in a couple of weeks from now. And then you're in this situation that which would be unprecedented. Mercedes 0 for 2 going into the season, and then having to fight back. And I mean, no disrespect to Lewis. I mean, he is one of the greatest racing drivers ever in Formula One. I mean, he's arguably the GOAT. I mean, there's no discussion there. But I've said for quite a while, I want to see somebody else win the championship, and obviously, I mean, you need that to sustain the interest. Yeah. However, like you say, it would be great to see him embroiled in a bit more of a title fight, rather than really racing off, and and basically not having to worry about too many people or even one other person pushing him. And I mean, if it comes down to a really well contested championship, he wins, I'm totally cool with that. I'm totally, I'm always for the best driver to win. But that's one thing I keep playing over my head, that maybe they don't get the results going into the first couple of races, how that would fundamentally change the look of the season that we've been so familiar with since 2014, and this absolute dominance by Mercedes during that time. And there was one other thing I was thinking about too, was, of course, the one thing, just going back to your point about how their times were good but not great. How many times have they've just come out and say, we're chasing perfection. Good is not good enough. If it's not great, it's not what we're aiming for. And that's what I think I find is really interesting about the issues that we saw with the car. And I mean, I don't have any doubts that they will be able to go back, figure out what the problem was, patch it, repair it, improve it, and ultimately become better, because this is a development on the W11, which was so successful last year, and they said this is the best car we've built, period, ever, as in all time. And I'm like, okay, well, this is very strange, because I mean, there is very limited development that they've done on this car since last season. So that's why I found it so amazing that they did have their issues during the testing. And if we might be sitting here on Sunday night recapping the race, and singing a completely different tune because Lewis goes out and smokes everybody, and he's 15 seconds down the down the road by the time the checkered flag is waved.
Yes. And I think the other piece too is, and we've talked about this so much the last couple of weeks, the other thing that would be really interesting about this narrative is that if Mercedes is on the back heel, the amount of drama that is going to explode into the media about Hamilton's contract situation and Bottas's contract situation, I think that's going to happen no matter how Hamilton performs. But if they're on the back heel right away, that's a storyline that's just going to drum and drum and drum all season. And I don't care what Hamilton and I don't care what Mercedes say, that will become a distraction, because if that's the first question they get every single time and they're under the gun constantly and they're perhaps not leading the championship, I just think that could potentially become a major. And I don't necessarily want it to be a storyline. I want the storyline to be the championship and a really competitive kind of last quarter of the season. But I think ultimately we know how F1 works and we know how the media works and we know how social media works. And sometimes things like a contract story attract more attention than maybe the championship itself. And that's been true the last 7 years because we really haven't had any competitive championships. But I would suspect that regardless of the outcome, but especially if they're not as competitive as they were last year, that story will permeate the season right from day one.
Yeah, absolutely. It might be a story that they don't want to have to deal with, but it might be something that they're going to have to put up with, and it's just going to be there. And I totally agree that if they struggle or if they have issues, that it's just going to that the intensity of that story is just going to increase over the season. But going back to Red Bull now, and I think that just sort of building on that statement that Helmut Marko made a couple of weeks ago, that this was, or was it Horner? I can't remember. One of them, anyway, said this was the best preseason that they've ever had. And I mean, the way that the things are stacked for them right now, I mean, they're going into the season in a great position. They have a very good driver lineup, the best lineup that they've had in their team since 2018, since it was Max and Danny Ricciardo. Obviously, it's been up and down. It's been in flux in between, and we've seen that revolving door in that second seat with Pierre Gasly and then Alex Albon, and now you get Sergio Perez coming in, and that's going to be an interesting story too, because I mean he's only on a 1-year deal, so I mean he's really going to be making his case to keep that seat going into 2022. Because let's not forget, I mean Sergio. Yeah, he's one of the older drivers on the grid, but he's only 31. I mean, he still potentially has quite a number of years in raceable years in Formula One in front of him. So, I mean, he's going to be going out to do everything. And I think his stock really rose a lot last year after he won that race in Bahrain. I think really, it was really well earned. I mean, that was one of those races that, has the potential to say, years from now that I remember that race. That's where he got punted off the track on the first lap of the race, ended up at the back of the pack and went on to win that one. It's definitely one of those races that will stand out in years to come. But yeah, I mean, they're setting up really, really nice. And the Honda engine has really proven to be, I wouldn't say a revelation, but it certainly has proven to be a very good engine over the past couple of years compared to where they were in 2015 or so, those first couple of years with McLaren, which were, well, we don't need to sugarcoat it. I mean, it was a complete disaster, and it was a big gamble that Red Bull took. But I mean, they kind of had that in-between year, the sort of try before you buy, when they put that engine into the back. And it was all that sort of bizarre thing, that whole scenario, what with Carlos Sainz going from Toro Rosso to Renault and the whole loan thing there. And then somehow, they get these Honda engines in the back of the Toro Rossos, and then they had this unique situation where they have the Honda engines in their basically their B team, and they've got the Renault power in their own team, which they've known for years and years and years because they had so much success with them prior to the turbo hybrid era with the normally aspirated engines when they won a number of championships, and they were able to basically compare the data head up, and then ultimately they went with Honda. And, to their credit, they said, we will keep them in year one on a similar level to where they finished off with Renault. And they did. They sort of competed and got similar results as they did. And there's been flashes of potential ever since. And I think that it really is something that we're going to be looking at to see, well, not just for this year, do they have enough power or more power compared to the Mercedes or the Ferrari and obviously the Renault? But I mean, Ferrari and Mercedes are the ones that they're basically measuring up against. And whether or not that and the Adrian Newey led design team at Red Bull have designed a really good car around that engine and whether or not that car, the RB16B, is it the?
Yep, you got it.
Is a contender, a legitimate rival to the Mercedes W12, and that's going to be the big question. I'm not putting a lot of stock into the first race of the year. It'll be interesting to see how, what the results are on Sunday evening. But ultimately, we'll have to take a look at this after 2, 3, 4 races, because by then we'll see everything kind of really settling in. We'll have a good idea after the first couple of races to see where all the teams are. And I want to get your thoughts on that, but we're going to take a quick break, so you can just you can take a deep breath, and then you can let her rip on the other side. So just hang in there, guys. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. And Mark, that was pretty evil of me to pull the mic away from when we were all locked and loaded and ready to spew. But knowing you've just let it like percolate and bubble beneath the surface. So I'll throw it back to you. I know I kind of threw out quite a number of little things, a number of topics there in the last segment. So take it away. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think I've got one piece to add to that before we kind of speak to my number 2 topic, which actually ties in perfectly with everything we've just been talking about. The other remarkable thing about Toro Rosso, now AlphaTauri, being a B team to Red Bull, is you can do some pretty cool stuff there. You can bring in drivers, you can develop drivers in a B team while getting reps at the Formula One level, or like you said, you can test out a power unit. And I think people forget that in 2016, Toro Rosso was running Ferrari power units. They went Renault, Ferrari with no factory support, running year-old engines, and then they went back to Renault before they moved on to Honda. So you can do some cool things there without compromising the performance of your top team. So that's pretty cool. So I think building on everything that we just talked about, I think one of the biggest storylines for me, and I almost shed a tear during winter testing, like you see those AlphaTauri cars and you see the Red Bull cars and you see the big, bold Honda font on that rear wing, front and back. And I shed a tear that this team could potentially, I shouldn't say team, this engine producer could potentially leave the sport, not necessarily at the pinnacle, but in a great place. And I think if you've heard from the Honda engineers, they are incredibly ecstatic about the power unit that they're bringing to the championship this year. They talked about the fact that they've got a better center of gravity. The engine is going to sit lower in the chassis. It's a more compact design. It's a lighter design. The thermal efficiency is improved. They're ecstatic about what they were able to do last year coming into this season. So they're ecstatic. I love having Honda in the championship. I think it is a huge detriment to Formula One to lose a manufacturer like this. I think it's a borderline, I shouldn't say a miracle, but I think it's very, very fortunate that Red Bull was able to negotiate a contract to buy the power unit IP. So we're still going to have this, if not Honda, at least we have this power unit producer within the sport. I think that's a good thing, because my biggest fear about F1 always is that it sheds its status as a prototype manufacturer and it goes to a spec racing series where every team buys the same chassis and every team has the same off-the-shelf parts and every team has 1 or 2 different power units. For me, that's a huge turnoff. And it's one of the reasons I can't get excited about I was going to say Champ Car, but IndyCar. It's one of the reasons I can't get excited about that series. And I always worry that that's the potential future of Formula One. And we are going to see some steps next year towards that as we see more unified parts and things like that. But I think one of the things that I'm going to be watching most closely this year is what does Honda's last official year in the sport look like? And you know what? They've come and gone before. I don't think they're coming back for all the reasons we've talked about in the past. I think F1's less attractive to a general production manufacturer than it's ever been. I don't think they're coming back, but I want to see them have supreme success this year. And I would love to see them in the mix for the championship. And I want to be clear as well. And I think I've quoted this on the air before. Honda's board was very, very divided about leaving F1. It really just came down to the chairman kind of putting in the deciding vote, but the board was split even about whether to leave or whether to stay. But I think it's really, really sad. I shed a tear during winter testing, and for Honda's sake, simply because I think it's good for the sport in Japan. And the other thing too is we've got a Japanese driver in the sport now too. Like, I think it's sad, but that's going to be a big storyline for me is what does Honda's last year in Formula One look like?
Yeah, hopefully they can go out on top. I mean, they've done some wonderful things in the sport over the years. But I mean, since the the 80s and the 90s when they saw quite a bit of success. I mean, going into the 2000s, I mean, their record has been a little bit. I don't want to say it's they were lacking commitments, but I mean it's sort of been hot and cold the way that they've gone into the sport. Now they've decided more to concentrate on their road fleet of cars, and I mean, which is understandable. I mean, Formula One is a massive kind of financial commitment at any level, right? And that just to your point about the IP being taken over by Red Bull. I mean, the amount of sort of like back end stuff that has been done and the business like that has been sorted out over the past year really astounds me. We had a new Concord agreement, the cost
Great
center,
point.
the fact that they were able to, like Red Bull was able to take over the Honda IP with. I know there were some concerns. They wanted this engine freeze, and some of the teams initially weren't too warm toward it. But I mean, some of the things that they've managed to do in the past 12 months in the middle of a pandemic is absolutely astounding, and they still managed to pull off a 17 race season. But yeah, absolutely, really looking forward to see what they can do in their final year. So I don't know if that went into what you wanted to talk about, or what was
That's good. That's good.
That was your story. So I'm up with my.
That wasn't good enough.
Yeah, well, no, I'm not saying it wasn't good enough. I wasn't sure. I kind of lost where the segue from one to the other was. So I didn't.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I was going to take my next one and have you glaring at me or sending me messages here while I'm talking. Say, hey, you jerk! I wasn't done talking yet. So
all good, all good. We can move on.
We can move.
Keep it moving.
So my next one here, and I kind of hinted at it in the very first segment, is how are the old dogs going to fare this year in Formula One? So I mentioned it in like I said in the first segment, but there are 7 drivers now that are currently over the age of 30. Now in modern professional sports and Formula One, that doesn't really mean as much as maybe in the old days, considering how supremely fit these guys are. But there's some interesting names in there. So you got Lewis, who's 36. You got Sebastian Vettel, 33. Sergio Perez and Danny Ricciardo, 31. Kimi Raikkonen, 41. Alonso, 39. And Valtteri Bottas, I can't remember what he's at. He's 31 or 32 as well, if I remember correctly. So, the first name that really jumps out of there is, for me, is Fernando Alonso. I mean, he left the sport a couple of years ago, tried out his hands in some different types of racing, been successful at, he's won Le Mans a couple of times with Toyota. He's had a couple of cracks at Indy, which, hasn't worked out for him yet. I mean, he's got 2 jewels in the Triple Crown. All he needs to do is win at the Brickyard to do what, has only been accomplished by Graham Hill back in the 1960s. So I know that is a priority for Fernando. But at 39 years old, it seems, I don't want to say a stretch, but I do find it interesting, like his desire to come back. I mean, he even said when he left the sport, when he left McLaren, that the door wasn't closed. And I just, considering the way that some of his the ways that he's burned bridges during his career with teams before in Formula One, kind of made me think at the time, you can say whatever you want, that you're not shutting the door on Formula One, but there's definitely some baggage there that you got to deal with. And there was only ever going to really be a couple of teams that that would seem as possible landing spots. McLaren would have been one, because he seemed to get on pretty good, especially with Zach Brown as the CEO at McLaren, and then Renault or Alpine would be the other one. So I mean, he's one that I'm definitely interested in. The other one too is Kimi Raikkonen. I mean, 41. I mean, he's not there to challenge for a championship at this point in his career, but I was surprised. I thought after last year, I didn't really expect to see Kimi Raikkonen back. I mean, it seems like he's been around forever. I mean, literally he has. I mean, there's probably people listening to the show that weren't born when Kimi Raikkonen first came into Formula One, which makes me feel extremely old, because I remember when he's broke into Formula One. So I guess that means I'm an old man. But anyways, but then you've got like, you take those 2 guys aside. I mean, Lewis kind of fits in the, in the middle of these sort of 30 plus drivers. And at this point, as long as he has a competitive car, I don't want to be that guy to say, oh yeah, I think Lewis is over it. I think he's over the top of the hill and he's starting to descend downwards. He's losing the edge. I mean, there's no sign of that whatsoever. But then you've got some interesting names, like in that lower end of that 30 plus category with Perez, Ricardo, Bottas, Vettel. He kind of fits in there as well. I mean, the one name that really stands out of that for me is Sebastian Vettel. I mean, 4-time world champion. I mean, he's obviously had some issues the past couple of years, but it was funny. And, I messaged you about this the other night when I said I'd sat down, to watch the 2009 Australian Grand Prix. I mean, that's, we'd been talking about on the show not so long ago, because that was when Braun GP, who had just taken over from Honda, who pulled out the year previously, came and surprised everybody. And I mean, Jensen went on to win the world championship that year. But it was really interesting because right at the end of the race, you have going into turn 3, and that's where Fernando had that huge crash in the McLaren a couple of years ago that, amazingly he walked away with just some sore, muscles and bruises and whatnot. But right at the end of the race there, we had Sebastian Vettel and Robert Kubica coming together about 2 or 3 laps from the end. And, I'd completely forgotten about that. But going into that corner, Sebastian, he got a little bit too deep going into turns 1 and 2, got out of shape. Kubica would have been chasing him down. This is the day before DRS. This is when we had KERS. We had that 7 seconds of that battery charge that you could use to get, what was it, an extra 70, 80 horsepower or something. Anyways, Sebastian, he got a little bit out of shape going into turn 2, and Kubica, was trying to pass him. They go into that corner. Seb, he was ahead, but the way that they came together, and then ultimately, there was tears in that one, and then it led to a safety car because there was a ton of crap on the track, and then Kubica managed to put it into the wall afterwards. But it's just like, yeah, it kind of puts some of Sebastian's issues or incidents that we've seen over the past, say, 24 months into a little bit more context. That one, I would have totally put it down to a 50-50 thing, incident between himself and Robert Kubica. I guess that would have been BMW at the time, wouldn't it? But that was so I mean let's just say that he hasn't been a stranger to incidents like that throughout his career. But I mean, certainly he has a lot to prove to try and resurrect his career at Aston Martin, and he's the one real name that jumps out there, with an honorable mention to his former Red Bull teammate Danny Ricciardo, who's taking a risk going to McLaren, and he's still thirsty for wins and podiums. And whether or not he'll be able to deliver that or achieve that with McLaren remains to be seen.
Okay, so just to be clear, your storyline here was old guys racing in Formula One.
Yes.
Is that it? Okay, cool.
Much, yes.
Okay, cool. You touched on a lot of stuff there.
I did. A lot to unpack, 100%.
So I want to touch on Fernando Alonso. So I thought it was interesting that you talked about his departure from F1. And for those of you that don't know, he's a 2-time world championship. He just missed the championship in 10, 12, 13, during that period of sustained Red Bull dominance. He goes to McLaren in 15, has a tough year in 15. Despite a terrible power unit, he finishes 10th in the championship, 16. And then 17, the season is terrible. And then 18, it's terrible. My sense is that he didn't want to leave Formula One at the end of 2018. My sense is nobody wanted him. Nobody. I don't think there was a chance in hell that he was going back to McLaren. I think he had 2 shots with McLaren. He was there in 07, didn't get along with Hamilton, didn't get along with the engineers, didn't get along with the media and the publicity department. He was gone. He comes back. He was vocal the entire time about how dissatisfied he was with the engine, how dissatisfied he was with Honda, the team. Like, he was never going back. No matter what Zach Brown and things like that said, he was never going back. And I honestly believe that in the months and the year that followed his departure, they bleached the McLaren Center top to bottom. Like, they just needed to clean it out and start fresh. And I think that's why Nando and Carlos Sainz were such a great breath of fresh air, because I think as long as Alonso was there, they knew they weren't competitive. They knew they weren't great. They knew they were in a bad place, but he added a degree of stress and tension that wasn't helpful to anybody. I don't think he was ever going back. And I think for 4 years, all of Formula One just watched this happen. Like, these weren't conversations that were happening behind closed doors. They were conversations that were having during the race being broadcast on the air, because he was saying this stuff over the radio. You know what I mean? So I think he's very, very lucky. Sorry?
Pardon me. I didn't mean to rudely jump in, but just to your point, what was in Russia, what was in 2017, and on the formation lap when the engine died, and the engineer says, I want to try you this, and this. And he says, no, why don't you come out and try it or do it? I'm done. And, you know, basically rolled into the pits before. Yeah, you can understand why a guy would be upset, but, you know, I thought, you know, that's not really the way to, you know, to do it, because you know that somebody's sitting there at mission control. There's no F-bombs in this. This is going on air, you know?
Yeah. And I think the only reason he got the second shot with Alpine is, one, Alpine wanted a marketable star. He's got history with the team. He's got history with the Enstone factory. There's a lot of personnel on that team that were there, believe it or not, when he won the championship, when they were Renault before they, So there's some history and some lineage there. So I think that's why his shot is there. Vettel's the one that I'm most interested in. We know Lewis is going to be great. Bottas will be Bottas, which to me is just boring. I think Ricardo, I think the move was great for him. I think he went to a better team with a great culture, and I think that was a good fit for him. I think the other story that's going to be really interesting for me is Vettel, because based on what I saw last year, again, despite everything that was happening, the drama, the culture issues, the performance issues, the drag issues, he wasn't as sharp as Leclerc, and he didn't get a great opportunity to get familiar with that Aston Martin in winter testing. Like, that's the other kind of senior driver that I'm most curious about, and also the one that I'm least confident in, just because of what we've seen over the last 2 years. And I want to be proven wrong. And that's kind of the segue, ideally, into my next story, if we're ready to go there. But that's the one that I want to be proven wrong on the most.
Yeah, I just want to finish it up before we take another break here. And just, you know, to that point about Sebastian Vettel, is that we've all changed jobs at some point in our lives. And, you know, after you give your notice, you know, a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is, you know, I can tell from personal experience that even though that I may have given my notice because I'm going to a new job, and, you know, even I'm still working hard to do what I need to do, it just feels different. And the difference with Sebastian is it wasn't made known right at the end of the season like it was for the Haas boys, right? He knew before they even got to the first race of the year that he was done, that you know, that Charles was going to be the chosen one going forward, even though they said that they weren't going to have any number one driver in 20 and all that sort of stuff. You just have to think that psychologically it's going to affect him on some level. And I think that Christian Horner summed it up nicely in Drive to Survive, saying it's like breaking up with your girlfriend, but she's still living in your house, you know, which I thought was an interesting comparison. But, you know, the point is well made. And it certainly is a fascinating story to watch. And like I say, I want to be proven wrong. I mean, you know, a lot of people have said that, you know, you don't win the world championship 4 times and then lose it overnight. And it's just how much, you know, does he have left in him? And, you know, how good is the new Aston Martin AMR 21? Anyways, Mark, we will go into the next, you know, the next storyline here. But first of all, we're going to take another break, and we'll come back. And then after that, I'm gonna virtually hand you the mic, and you can have your turn. And we'll do so in just a moment. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to the show. We're breaking down some of the big storylines we're looking at going into this season. Mark, over to you. You're up. Blow us away with some of that famous, infamous insight and wisdom of yours.
I don't know that any of that's true, but you're very, very, very kind. I think the next one, and the third big story for me is Aston Martin, and it's almost cliche because everyone's talking about Aston Martin, but it really kind of pairs kind of a couple of things that we talked about. One, a Canadian driver in Lance Stroll. It pairs Sebastian Vettel. It pairs the narrative that you have this traditional, historical British manufacturer re-entering the sport for the first time in 60 years. It's a culmination of all of the work that Lawrence Stroll has invested into both Aston Martin as a road car manufacturer and Force India / Racing Point as an F1 team over the last couple of years. This is the culmination. This is everything that Lawrence was working towards. And I'm ecstatic, extremely excited to see how this culminates on the track. Is he going to see a return on his very substantial investment? Is Stroll going to be able to string together a really consistent year? And I'll be honest, like if you look back at last year, despite a tough start in the first race, Lance had 7 great finishes out of the first 8 races, and in the middle of the season kind of fell apart. He got COVID. Then he qualifies on pole in Turkey, only for a physical damage on the front wing to cost him a race victory. Like there's flashes there. If he can string together a great season from front to back, if Vettel can compete for podiums consistently week over week, if Stroll can lean into Vettel and learn from his racecraft and his approach to the race weekend, good things can happen there. I still don't think that they're going to be competing for second place in the championship, and we'll get to our predictions in a minute. But I think the ceiling for this team is 3, but I think the basement potentially could be 5. It could potentially be 6, depending on how competitive ultimately McLaren and Ferrari are. So I think this is going to be very, 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 very interesting. But to me, there's still just a ton of uncertainty. We didn't get to see the car a ton in winter testing because of the reliability issues they had. Yeah. We haven't had the opportunity to see Vettel put in significant mileage. Now, we're only hours away from free practice 1 at Bahrain. So by the time you and I wake up, he will have gotten some additional mileage in this car. So we might know a lot more come morning Pacific Standard Time. But this is the story that for me is the most interesting one. The car looks amazing. They managed to secure a ton of sponsorships. They've got a championship driver. They've got a young, very talented driver. They've got an owner that is pouring every imaginable resource into the team. Everything suggests that it could be a great season. Again, I still think 3rd place in the championship is their ceiling. And I think internally that's probably what they're looking at. But I also think that realistically, they could very easily finish 5 or 6. So that's the storyline that I'm most interested in out of everything that's going to happen this year. Over to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, you make a couple of really good points there. And I can't remember who made this quote during the winter testing, but they said, there's no midfield or no, it's just a grid now. It's just because you had like this real sort of gap between the top couple of teams and then, Williams all the way at the back. But I mean, there's such parity already between teams like Racing Point / Aston Martin, McLaren, Renault, all those teams that we saw, like show moments of brilliance at times last year. I mean, we saw Ricciardo get a couple of podiums. We know what McLaren did. I mean, Renault, as frustrating as they were, I mean, it was, they showed something. They showed something was going there. I mean, like you said before, they've all been fighting for the scraps that were left by Ferrari because they were nowhere last year. And there was, some real flashes from Racing Point that something very special could happen. I mean, I know that you and I are total homers, and of course, we're always going to cheer for the home guys, the home team, right? But could you imagine if we're sitting here at the end of the year and we see Lance in a top 5 finish in the Drivers' Championship? I mean, we'll be losing our minds. I mean, it might actually become too annoying for all the listeners that that aren't fans of Lance Stroll, but. Still, I mean, I think that the potential is really there. But I mean, like you say, we saw the issues that they had with reliability during winter testing, and that's going to be the one thing that could potentially be a make or break thing. I mean, they did last year design a very, very good car to the points that was detailed very nicely in Drive to Survive Season 3. Was all the controversy around it, not just the brake ducts, which was such a detail, like such a such a specific thing that they went after and protested about, and they were ultimately nailed on. But it was just the whole idea that they'd stolen that design concept basically for that RP20 that off of the previous year's Mercedes was was that like a gray area? Was it over the line? But regardless, I mean, it was deemed to be a legal car, and I mean, Otmar Szafnauer even said. In last year's version, or sorry, no, it wasn't in Drive to Survive from last year, from season 2. I'm sorry, it was a quote that I'd seen him give. Either was in the media or was an article, but basically he said that before they got the RP20 working well, they'd actually regressed to where they were with the 2019 car, just because they decided to go with like the same concept, the same aero concept that the Mercedes had used with the W19, or sorry, the W10 in 2019, and it just wasn't an easy thing to figure out, and it kind of took me back to the whole thing of like the Tupolev Tu-144 and the Concorde, the Concorde ski. If you've ever wanted an interesting documentary, go look that one up. It was basically back in the 60s when the French and the British designed designed the Concorde, and the Russians basically tried to clone and make their own, and Concorde was world famous, and the Concordsky famously crashed at the Paris Air Show, and it was a disaster. So, and I mean, they looked very, very similar. So, I mean, just because you copy something doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. And I mean, with like the Concorde, I mean, like the shape of the wing and the aerodynamics was so advanced, and it was just something that the Russians just couldn't match at the time. So, I mean, you take that parallel and kind of bring that forward 30 or 40 years to the Racing Point, the whole pink Mercedes scandal. And it was interesting too, just how much that really pissed them off, especially Lawrence Stroll, how angry that whole, comparison to the pink Mercedes really made him. But, it is fascinating to see where these teams are going to go and what potentially they could do. Anyways, Mark, I want to hit my last point here before we kind of draw a line in the sand, and then we're going to do some predictions after the last break here coming up in a couple of minutes. But my last one is it's just basically bringing forward something that we were all talking about this time last year, and it's like, what is this season ultimately going to look like? Obviously, COVID is still here. Obviously, we're all in the middle of a pandemic, and it's affected Formula One. We've seen people test positive for COVID just in the past couple of weeks. Obviously, we had the Australian Grand Prix bumped from its traditional season opener to later in the year into November. So potentially, there is things that could still change. And we saw how very good they were really able to change it up on the fly in 2020. I mean, the fact that we got a 20 race season in after that, after the delay, after it was canceled in Australia, to the point that we actually started getting, back to racing at the beginning of July, that was a very, very long break. And I'm sure there was a lot of work that went on behind the scenes. And I know, I mean, when you look at that calendar and you look at what the pandemic situation is in some of the countries around the world, I kind of look at it sometimes and I'm just like, I don't know, is this thing really going to go off as planned, or are we going to be sitting here with some free weekends in between, trying to fill, come up with some content? Your thoughts?
I totally agree. I think this is going to be, I think we look at the calendar for this year and it looks great on paper. Yeah. I'm not confident it's going, at least the first half isn't necessarily going to play out as anticipated. I think we've already seen some disruption. You make that great point about the fact that Australia was bumped. Fortunately, we're still going to see a race in Australia this year. It's just going to happen later in the season. I'm still not confident that Canada's going to happen at all. I don't think they go through the effort of assembling that track if they're not going to introduce spectators. From what I understand, it's a 60-day build to get that track ready, which means they need to start getting it ready within 2 weeks. I don't think that's going to happen. Baku is going to happen, I believe, but it will be spectatorless still. But I think as we start to get into the back half of the calendar, we'll start to see a greater degree of normalcy. And I think we're going to start to see more and more and more fans at the races. And it was funny too, because when I was watching Drive to Survive, I forgot how many spectators were in Russia last year. And maybe that was a little bit bold, but I think just the logistics of the calendar are still a little bit unpredictable. And I think things will become firmer and firmer, fingers crossed, as the season progresses. But I think it's going to be interesting. And I think the other thing too, and I only just thought about this now, and I know you've talked about it in the past, is if all things do fall into place, this is a 23 race calendar. Like this is unprecedented. Like the amount of strain and stress that you're going to put on the teams during a pandemic as they hop around the globe is going to be unprecedented, especially when you look at the number of double headers and the number of triple headers and the lack of downtime during the season. We've talked about team principals. They're not going to be at every single race. I think that's going to become the norm. Maybe they don't need to be there. I think you're going to ultimately end up seeing teams that have to build multiple crews of engineers because they're not going to be available for every race weekend. They're going to need break. Like, I think this is going to be a real stress test for the teams, especially since I'm still confident that Liberty's long-term vision isn't a 23 race calendar. I think they want a 25 race calendar. And I think they want to be racing from the beginning of March until the middle of December. They want 2 more races in the US. I think this is just, this is very much a stress test to see what they need to do for the future, not to see whether it's possible or as a proof of concept, but rather like, hey, we're going to be doing this. Let's learn from a 23 race calendar and see what changes we need to make to expand to a 24 or 25 race calendar. Because I think adding those additional races in the US are less about the hosting fees associated with those races. I honestly think F1 Liberty, if there was a track available in Miami, they would go to Miami without hosting fees, because the value of having races in the US is the exposure that they get on TV. You want US eyeballs on those races. Austin's good, but if you had a sexy race in Miami, if you had a race in the Northeast, that does great things for the sport. It attracts younger fans, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's their target is 25, but 23 races, man, super unprecedented. And I'll be honest, like I was doing my head the other day, like how many podcasts is that? Geez, we're gonna have to spend 20, it's a chore, but 23 Sundays recapping races. That's crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's you think about it, we do one show a week, just a normal show, and you got to add another 23 shows on top of it. I mean, it's no wonder. I was looking at it, the other podcast I did, we got up to 280 something episodes up until the end of last year, and we're already on episode 234. I mean, if we're doing 80 episodes a year, I mean, that's going to blow the other show out of the water, pretty quick. But like it's a chore, right? I mean, the time flies by when you're having fun. But I was the one thing that kind of went through my mind when you were just breaking that all down was, I just see somewhere Chase Carey sitting there, sort of saying, guys, if we can pull off 23 races in a pandemic, yeah. 25 under normal circumstances is going to be a lot easier. Relatively speaking, of course, but yeah, it's a monster. It's a mammoth undertaking to do it in the framework of a pandemic, and it will be interesting too, because I can see that Baku happening, because that's not a race that gets a lot of spectators anyways. I think it's under 10,000, just because there's not a lot of spots to put grandstands around there. It's very much like Monaco, even though it's the track is a lot larger. I mean, it is an urban center. There's lots of offices and apartments and shops and everything you would find in in the downtown core of a city. Monaco is interesting. Montreal is interesting too, because even though the track is on Ile Notre Dame in the middle of the St. Lawrence Seaway, it's out of the downtown core. So I mean, I guess you could you don't need people to go there. I mean, you could put the Formula One bubble on the island and just ferry them back and forth between hotels and sort of isolate them that way. But so I mean, I can see that one happening without having to put the grandstands up, and the race organizer probably wants to see people in the stands, even if it's say reduced numbers like we saw at Mugello, or say the Nürburgring. Hopefully not like we saw at Sochi last year, which was like you say, a pretty bold move by the race organizers, but a bit of a different time, I suppose. But yeah, it could definitely change. I'd like to say that it's gonna turn out the way as planned, but I'm keeping my mind open and just thinking that, okay, well, we got 23 races coming up, but I'm just planning that there might be some free weekends at some point during the season. Let's just put it that way. Anyways, guys. Excuse me, let's just take one more final break here on the Overtime Media Network, and then we're going to come back and we're going to change up our season preview a little bit different, because we're going to do our predictions, but we're going to do it mano a mano, teammate versus teammate, who's going to do better, and then ultimately we're going to, I guess, we'll go there and do the rather, I guess, normal thing and make our predictions who's going to win the championship, and we'll do so in just a moment. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, well, welcome back to the podcast, everybody. And yes, it's that time. We've kind of gone down over the past hour or so, breaking down some of the different storylines and pulled on some of those different threads of things we're going to be watching this year. But let's do a preview now. Let's go down team by team and who we think is going to who's going to come out on top in each of the respective teams. Mark, do you want to take that one away?
Yeah, I'm going to start with Haas. And I only start with Haas because they're the team that I'm least interested in and generally despise. But I think Mick Schumacher, and I'm not even going to speak to the other driver, but I think Mick Schumacher, just because of goodwill and good wishes and because of his lineage, I think he's going to be the better performing driver. He won't score any points. He won't get out of Q1, but I think he will definitely outperform his teammate. What about you?
Yeah, I think so. I think that that Mick has the pedigree. I mean, a lot of the feedback that I've heard already coming from Haas is just that there's a lot of his old man in him, and just the way he he carries himself, and just also the some of the talent, like you said. So I think that he will come out on top of those two drivers. I think I'm going to be really optimistic. I'm going to go out on a branch here. I'm going to say that that Mick scores a point this year. I'm predicting. I'm going to predict one top 10 finish. I'm just sort of feeling it, for him. And I mean, that team's due a little bit of luck. I mean, they've had some very, very difficult times. I mean, it was detailed quite a bit, especially that episode of DTS season 3, when we saw Gunther Steiner in the middle of a pandemic going out and trying to get sponsors on board. So, there is a lot going on there. Hopefully they have the funding to, put together a competitive season. But I like Mick Schumacher. I like him as a driver. I like him more as a person. And I'm feeling it. I'm going to say one top 10 finish for him. Who's up next? Where do you go from Haas?
For me, Williams.
Yeah.
And I think this is a slightly more involved conversation. I think we have every reason to think that George Russell will outperform Nicholas Latifi. I just hope that the delta shrinks. So last year, George Russell outqualified Nicholas Latifi 16-0. Latifi ultimately did outperform him in 5 races, but that was largely because of reliability issues with George Russell's car. George Russell massively outperformed him from a qualifying perspective. Yeah. That 16-0 is not totally indicative of what it actually looks like. George Russell pulled that Williams into Q3 once. He pulled it into Q2 9 times. I don't know that Latifi got into Q2, I think, once last year. So I think Russell shows the benchmark of what that car is capable of. They got to start splitting the difference in qualifying. I think George Russell will definitely be a better performer. I think they're both going to score some points this year, maybe 1 or 2 for Latifi, maybe 10 or 15 ultimately for George Russell. But I think there's every reason to think that George Russell is going to outperform Nicholas Latifi this year.
Yeah, I don't think there's a big question on that. I mean, just based on what you said, I mean, the fact that he was able to take that car out of Q3 the number of times that he did, and then also, I mean, he was pushing to score points in that extremely uncompetitive car last year. And I think Sebastian Vettel came P10 was at the Tuscan Grand Prix, and he kind of said afterwards that he took the points, but he really felt a bit of a bugger for taking that away from George Russell, who probably deserved it. I mean, George had his issues, and I mean, he should have won that race. At Bahrain, or the Sakir, I guess the second race, but ultimately for all the issues that they had, and then. The thing was the way that it all got botched up, that not only did he lose his chance to win that race, he almost lost his chance to score points. Would have been doubly cruel because he did so well. I mean, when you sort of carry all that forward, I think that George Russell has demonstrated last year just he's still a young driver, still, what was he, 23, I believe.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are signs that he could be a very, very good racing driver. I think he really raised a lot of eyebrows what he did, filling in for Lewis Hamilton, driving Lewis's car, and I don't think there's really any doubts in the pairing who's going to be the better driver this year.
Totally. And I want to add as well that, again, I'm not being a homer. I still think Latifi's a very talented driver, and I think his reliability and his racecraft last year showed it. He doesn't make flagrant mistakes. He's a smart driver on the track, but he's got to find some pace this year. He's got to find pace in qualifying because he needs to put himself into a better position come race day, and then he needs to be able to sustain that pace throughout the race weekend, and I'm confident he's going to be able to do that. And the good news is he's got a teammate that's extracting every ounce of potential out of the same car. So like, he's got this great benchmark, and if he can learn from Russell and they can share data and they can share information, he should be able to improve this year. And I totally think he would. I'll let you go this time, but Alfa Romeo, what do you think about the Alfa Romeo teammates?
I think that they're going to be sort of the same. I think, Giovinazzi, I think, is an interesting driver. I think that I think this is going to be a make or break season for him in Formula One. I mean, let's not forget, I mean, he's not the youngest driver out there. I think we kind of think that he's, sort of in the George Russell, Charles Leclerc, that sort of class of drivers. But if you look at Antonio Giovinazzi, he's 27. I mean, he sort of comes across as much younger. I mean, not that 27 is, particularly particularly old. But I think it's a make or break season, and I think that it's going to go back and forth between him and Kimi Raikkonen. But I think Kimi is still proven he's still a good Formula One driver. He's still quick, relatively speaking, in terms, frame that in the perspective of Alfa Romeo. And whether or not they're going to be good enough to ultimately score some points, I don't know. I mean, the big question I think that comes down, I mean, the car's going to be okay. They're not going to be building one of the best cars on the grid, and I think the real Achilles heel for that team is going to be the Ferrari engine. If Ferrari delivers a stronger power unit this year, then I wouldn't be surprised if they sneak some points here and there during the season. But I think ultimately back and forth, it's going to go between the two, and I think I'd still give the edge to Kimi Raikkonen. If they bring some points home this year, I think Kimi's going to. I think he'll snag slightly more points than Antonio will.
Yeah, my decision was less scientific. I went to write Giovinazzi, couldn't spell it. So then I tried to write Raikkonen, couldn't spell it. And then it just ended up writing Kimi. And I'm still sure I spelled that wrong. But I think all things being equal, I think this is going to be a make or break season for Giovinazzi. Just like you said, I think he's a great guy, great personality. He's been around the Ferrari team and the Ferrari factory for a while. I don't know that he's going to get a second shot next year or another shot next year unless he puts in some really solid performances this year. Kimi's continued to prove that he's a very, very reliable, consistent driver, and his racecraft is still there. And I think there were moments last year where he had a little bit of pace for whatever reason, and he was still very racy, and he was still fighting in corners, and he was doing the things that you want to see a former world champion do in a uncompetitive car. So I'll give the nod to Kimi just based on past experiences. Like the tiebreaker for me is he's a world champion, and ultimately Antonio Giovinazzi is not a world champion. But and to your point as well, Giovinazzi is not a young driver. He's 27, like he's pushing 30. He has been around the sport. He's had a full-time drive now for a couple of years. He's been a test driver at Ferrari, so he's familiar with the power unit, the gearbox, and all those kind of things. But I'll give the nod to Kimi because he's got that 2007 title.
There you go. Okay, where do we go from here? Let's pick Alpine. Who are you going to go with that one? I'm actually going to go with Esteban Ocon. I think.
Whoa! Controversy.
Controversy, because I mean, Fernando, he's been out of Formula One for 2 years, which does not seem like a very long time in normal life. But Formula One has changed quite a bit. And also Fernando, I mean, he was in that cycling accident just only several weeks ago. He's admitted he's still not 100%. I mean, he's got a lot of things. He's got to get up to speed with the car. He's got to regain his health. And I think that if Esteban has a good start to the season, that I think that potentially he could do better, at least in the first half of the season, but or at least in the start of it. I don't know. First half might be pushing it, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think that it's necessarily going to be picking up where you left off for Fernando Alonso.
You are wrong, good sir. And here is why. So it's kind of interesting, right? Like you've got Ocon racing for a French team in Alpine, but ultimately their marketable star is their former world champion in Fernando Alonso. And I don't know why. I feel like despite everything that you just said, despite the fact that he's been out of the sport for 2 years, despite the fact that he's recovering from a crash, like and I'm not a big Fernando Alonso fan. Like, I don't love the guy. He like his attitude at McLaren, it really turned me off. And like, I appreciate how authentic and transparent he is, but I just thought he could have been more of a professional. I feel like he's a very consistent driver. I think he's going to get really strong grip on that car. And I think he's going to be cashing in points early. And I think if Ricciardo did anything last year, it's that he showed that there's really some strong potential in that car. And Renault had made some really strong strides in the last 12 months. This was a car that was on the podium last year twice, which is remarkable. And I think if you put Alonso in it, I think he's going to be a competitive driver despite the age and I don't know why. Like, I just have more confidence in Alonso at this age in his career than Vettel for whatever reason. So for me, I'm going to give and I'm making notes of all of these because I think we should revisit this as a podcast in November. And we just like, how close were we? But I feel like ultimately Alonso is going to score more points this year than Esteban Ocon.
Well, Esteban was an interesting one last year because it was his first year back in Formula One because he'd lost his seats the year prior. So he had 1 year on the sidelines. He was reserve driver for Mercedes. So, I mean, he basically spent the entire 2019 season in the garage at Mercedes waiting for, the opportunity to fill in for either Valtteri or Lewis, which ultimately didn't happen. And I think that really set him back. I think that towards the end of the year, we saw a little bit more from Esteban Ocon. And I mean, apart from that one incident where when he took out Max Verstappen when he was leading the Brazilian Grand Prix, I think that his stint at Racing Point as a young driver at the time, I think he did quite well. I think he really showed some potential. And I think that that 1 year, that year in 2019, sitting on the sidelines really hampered his development. So I think he'll definitely have a stronger year. So whether or not, yeah, I know I'm being quite bold in saying he's going to be better than his two-time world champion teammates, but definitely whatever happens, I think he's going to have a better year.
Yeah, so here's the thought. And, I had to look up the championship standings from last year. So I agree with everything you're saying. I think that year sitting out was problematic for his development. It's probably a good thing, though, that he was around Lewis and that team, so he could see how a championship team operates. And like you said, you'd awkwardly see him in the garage at every race wearing the Mercedes apparel. But, here, let's flash back to last year. So Daniel Ricciardo, driving for Renault, finished 5th in the championship with 119 points and 2 podiums. Esteban Ocon, driving the exact same car, finished 12th with half as many points.
Yeah.
That's a pretty significant. No, again, Esteban Ocon, he had that podium in Sahir at the end of the season, but that's a pretty significant delta between two drivers, right? It's not like they were both in the top 6 or the top 7. That was a tough year. Ocon had some reliability issues and made some mistakes. He had 4 retirements, and I think Daniel Ricciardo only retired once all year last year, but still, that's a pretty significant delta between the two drivers. But yeah, you're right. So let's see how that wraps up.
I was just going to say before we move on, I think the only bigger similar delta that we would have seen between teammates last year would have been between the Red Bull drivers, between Max and Alex Albon. I can't remember. I don't have the numbers up in front of me what the difference was, but it was a similarly massive gap between them. I mean, Max finishing so far up in the championship. He finished what, 3rd, right? I mean,
yeah, 109 points, 109 point difference.
Yeah. Massive, especially when you're in a team like that. Well, why don't we let's see, where do we go from here? So we've done let's talk about AlphaTauri.
Yes.
This is going to be an interesting one. I think that as tough as it was that Pierre Gasly lost his seat with Red Bull and was demoted to Toro Rosso, which then rebranded last year as AlphaTauri, I think the move did him good. I think that Red Bull was the right opportunity at the wrong time for him. I think it just came too soon, but they just didn't have any other options. What with Ricciardo leaving in at the end of 2018, and the fact that they just did not have enough junior drivers with super license points or anybody else that they could bring into the team, that they were kind of stuck. And ultimately, I think that hurt Gasly. But despite everything that happened, I think he had a very, very strong 2020. I think that he's, I'd say that maybe the, how do you want to call it? And maybe not the underdog, but maybe the unsung hero award for 2020. I mean, he won in Italy. I mean, he was maybe the beneficiary of some, being in the right place at the right time when it came to the safety cars and everything like that. And I mean, if that lap, if that race had gone 5 laps more, perhaps he's finishing on the 2nd step of the podium, and it's Carlos Sainz that's, taking home the honors that day. But regardless, I think that he's done a wonderful job. And Yuki Sonoda, I mean, Japanese driver, I mean, he did very well in winter testing, but I mean, first year in Formula One, he's still a young guy, and just the fact that Gasly's had a couple of years in the sport and seems to really, found a really comfortable groove at AlphaTauri. I think just based on that alone, unless Tsunoda comes out to be an absolute prodigy and completely proves me wrong, which would be awesome. But I think just based on where they're at in their respective careers, I think you have to pick Gasly in this one.
Yeah, I think Yuki's going to be awesome. I think he's going to have a great year, and I think he's potentially going to have a great career, but he's not going to finish ahead of Pierre Gasly this year. And you look at Pierre Gasly last year, this is a guy that in races that he only finished out of the points, I think 3-4 times. Like, he strung together a great, even aside from the race win in Italy, he had a really great compact year. Like, he did some great things on the track. And I think he's going to build on that this year. And I don't think the car is going to be worse. I think it's going to be better. AlphaTauri and I don't want to get too excited about winter testing. AlphaTauri looked fantastic. I think he will probably finish ahead of Yuki, but I think Yuki will surprise a lot of people because because he wasn't necessarily racing in European championships all the way up through his career, I think he's a little bit off the radar for the traditional mainstream Formula One press. But I think he's going to surprise this year. But I agree. I think Gasly's going to outperform just because of the experience piece. And I think for Yuki as well, this is a pretty daunting ask, right? A 23 race calendar with Formula One G forces, Formula One grip, all of the travel, all of the media obligations. I think it's going to be a grind for him, and I think he's going to get pretty worn out, but I think he's ultimately going to put in a pretty good campaign himself. But Gasly for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we got basically half of the grid down. Let's go and talk about, let's go with McLaren.
Oh,
Let's go with McLaren. So why don't you have at it first? Because I've got my thoughts on this one, but I'm curious to see where you're going to take it, and then I'll weigh in afterwards.
so just the way you frame that, I know you're going to try and surprise everyone here. But it's funny because, as much as I think McLaren may have been disappointed that Carlos Sainz asked for the opportunity to speak to and eventually sign with Ferrari, I think they're in a better place than they were when they had Carlos Sainz. I think Daniel Ricciardo is an upgrade. He's won races. He's always been competitive. He's hugely charismatic. He's a great culture guy. I think he's going to do some great things for that team. I also think he's a better driver than Lando Norris. He had a couple of podiums last year. He's won multiple races in his career. I think he's going to outperform Lando. And I think you're going to disagree, and I want to hear why.
I don't want to disagree. I just think that this one, I think that that Ricciardo will be the one that comes up on top, but I think it's going to be very close between the two drivers. I think that this pairing of Danny Ricciardo and Lando Norris is very, very strong. I totally agree in what you said that he's an upgrade. Danny Ricciardo is an upgrade on Carlos Sainz. And I think that he just brings a lot that I think that they're just going to benefit from them. I think that McLaren is sitting in a very, very good place right now. They've got a decent car, they got a great engine, they got two very, very good drivers, and it's just my only question is how close are these two drivers going to be? And I think it really could, I see them finishing as high as third in the championship, but I see them, very similar to like we were saying earlier about Aston Martin. I could also see them finishing fifth or sixth, just depending how it all shakes out. But I think in terms of the two drivers, I think that they're going to be pretty close. I think Lando, he's got a long career ahead of him in Formula One. But I think at this point, Ricciardo, being the proven quantity that he is, I think that he just has that edge.
Yeah, I could totally agree.
Yeah.
I think then we can move on to the next team. So the next team for me, and it's funny because the order we've been going through them so far is the order that actually had them written until McLaren. But I think next we go Ferrari.
Sure.
And for me, there's no debate. I think Charles Leclerc is more familiar with the power unit, the gearbox, the car, the grip. He's a more established driver. He has a race win, 2 race wins. I think ultimately, especially with his familiarity with that car and that team, I think he's going to ultimately be the better of the two drivers this year.
Yeah, I agree. I think that they've got a good pairing in Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Whether that's say going to be as competitive, as strong as I think that that McLaren has with their driver pairing, or as I think that perhaps Red Bull has with Verstappen and Perez. I don't think that these two are. But there's a lot of question marks. So we kind of know what some of the other ones are. I mean, all respect to Carlos Sainz. I mean, I think he's a very good race driver. Whether or not he's going to be able to deliver in a Ferrari, that is the big question. And I mean that speculation and all that, the expectations are just go up. I mean, we know that Charles is going to do it. He's proven it so far in his first couple of years with Ferrari. Now it's the big question is, can Carlos Sainz do it under that microscope and in that fishbowl that is Ferrari? And I mean that could be one of the deciding factors that really how do you want to say it, that really determines how he does it. Ferrari is just all the intense pressure that come along with having that seat there. So absolutely. Yeah, I mean for sure, 100% Charles comes out on top in this one.
I'll let you take the next one, but Aston Martin.
Sure. This one's interesting too. I think that it really comes down to, like we were saying earlier in the show, I think that a lot of what their season is going to be based on is the reliability. And I think if they have, they've got reliability in the car, I think that I think just based on where they're at, I think that Sebastian Vettel will be come out on top of Lance Stroll, because I think some of the things that I heard, some of the feedback that came out of Aston Martin after testing was that they feel that he's going to be able to drive that car better than Sergio Perez did. As a racing point in the Force India, I guess from what I understand that Sergio's a little bit more of a brutish when it comes to sort of manhandling and throwing that car around the track, whereas Sebastian, he's got a little bit more finesse, a little bit more graceful driving style. And if they've got a good car and that car is reliable, I think that he'll do well. How well that is compared to everybody else, that remains to be a huge unanswered question. And I think that Lance will definitely have his moments. I think he's going to suck up a lot, absorb a lot this year, year one of this Aston Martin project. And definitely I see at times too that Lance could outperform Sebastian as well. I mean, we saw those flashes last year with with Racing Points and how he was better than Perez. But I'm still going to give the edge to Vettel. I think that he's got a lot to prove, and I think if the car is good, I think he'll be able to deliver.
My fear is that if I say Lance, it's because Vettel has a disappointing year. But having said that, I think Lance needs somebody to push him. And I don't think he's at the stage in his career where he's going to just flat out outperform his teammate, maybe next year, maybe the year after. I don't think he's at that stage. But my fear is that if he does outperform Vettel this year, it just means Vettel's had a horrific year. And you know what? Lance may have been no better, but Vettel just really struggled. But I hope, and you know what? For the sake of the Formula One spirits and gods, I'm going to say Vettel, because I need to see that happen. And I think if Vettel finishes well, I think Lance will ultimately finish well also. And, you just look back to last year, it was that 6-race run that really derailed Lance's season. He retires at the Tuscan Grand Prix. He retires in Russia. In Germany, he's out with COVID. Portugal, he retires. He's 13 when they go back to Italy. And then he goes to Turkey. And then he has that mechanical failure, which costs him the championship, or not the championship, a race victory. Like, if things had gone just a little bit differently, he could have been a top 5 driver last year. And then we're not even talking about these doubts. Like, the season could have been very different for him. So I'm going to say Vettel, because I think if Vettel has a good season, I think Lance will have a good season, because he's pushing, he's learning, all that kind of stuff. But I think, I'll say Vettel as well. You've changed my mind.
There we go. Okay, well, let's we got the last 2 teams now, the top 2 teams. Let's go with Red Bull. We'll save Mercedes because they deserve to go last, because they've earned that sort of spot of honor.
Totally.
For me, there's no question. I think that the Max Verstappen is going to be the top driver in this team. The only question that I have is the delta between him and Sergio Perez. Without a doubt, Sergio is an upgrade on the drivers that they've had in that seat, and Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly over the past couple of years. The big question is now, how is he going to be able to perform? Is he going to be say a top 5 kind of driver, or is he going to be somebody that's maybe pushing for a podium on a more frequent, more regular basis? I mean, we know Max will. We know that Max will be pushing as good as he can, and I hope it's not going to be last year where you have Lewis and Valtteri Bottas out front. Excuse me, and then 4 or 5 seconds down the road, you have Max Verstappen, and then 20 seconds, after Max, you've got everybody else. I hope that's not going to be the case, but that's my only real question: is how close to Max is Sergio going to be?
Yeah, I think it's going to be close. I mean, ultimately, you look at the championship last year, and this is bananas. Max Verstappen finished 3rd, 9 points behind Bottas, but Max Verstappen had 5 retirements to Bottas's 1, and he only finished 9 points behind him.
It's an amazing stat.
It's crazy. Like, I have no reason to think that Max won't finish 2nd this year. Sergio Perez, driving that Racing Point Force India mashup last year, finished 4th. Like, I think, to your point, like, I think Max is going to finish ahead of Sergio Perez, but I don't think it's going to be by much. And I think, and we'll get to this in a couple of minutes, this is why I think the Constructors' Championship is wide open this year, totally wide open. But I think it'll be Max, and I think Sergio is going to be there. And the question is not, hey, how many points. It's going to be how close. They're going to be so close. So I think that kind of wraps up Red Bull. And I don't want to speak too much more about it because it'll kind of cut into our kind of predictions, which we'll get to in a minute. But finally, we'll just kind of finalize this segment with Mercedes, and I'll let you go first because I think I know where you're going to go.
Well, I mean, the question is, I mean, obviously it's going to be Lewis, and I'm just thinking how many races into the season are they going to try and drag out the narrative this year that Bottas is a title contender?
B 3.0.
Yeah, come on. So I mean, no respect to Valtteri Bottas, but let's keep things in perspective here. Until it's quantifiably proven that Lewis is not the Lewis that we've known all these years, then I don't see somebody driving the same car as him is going to be able to push him. So that's basically it. I don't think there's really much in that discussion at all.
Yeah, I'm done. Let's move on to our predictions. Yeah, it's obviously Hamilton.
For what, Mercedes, or for the championship as well?
Well, both. Let's go to our predictions. Unless you want to take a break first.
No, I think I've pretty much almost come to the end of almost everything that I have to say for almost the entire show here, and I'm going to say, just based on what we've seen for 2014, is I'm going to predict Mercedes are going to win both the drivers and the constructors championship this year. Excuse me. I do think it's going to be closer, and the only reason that I'm not going to throw it, say, to Red Bull to win the constructors or the drivers championship is just that they've proven to be too strong, and until I really see sustained and consistent weakness in them, I mean, it's possible that somebody comes out and has a strong season and beats them, and I certainly hope that's the case. But I mean, just based on the body of work over the past 7 seasons now, that I'm really reluctant to bet against them, especially that they started the season strong, and they finished the season strong. I mean, Abu Dhabi was maybe a bit of an asterisk. We all suspect that they had they detuned the engines to a certain degree, just for some of the issues that they're having. But and until I'm proven otherwise, I just cannot bet against them.
Yeah, I agree. I think the championship's going to look different this year. Lewis is going to win the title. I think the constructors is more wide open because my sense is that Lewis is going to finish first. I think Max is going to finish second. I think Valtteri is going to finish a relatively distant third, and then Sergio is going to finish fourth, which is why the constructors is going to be more wide open than I think we've seen it in many, many, many years. Should have been closer last year if Alex Albon had put in a better performance and Max Verstappen had not had so many retirement and mechanical issues. But I think ultimately for me, Lewis wins the title, McLaren or Mercedes wins the constructors, but just Red Bull's a very close second, followed by McLaren, followed by Aston Martin, followed by Ferrari. That said, though, I think that 3, 4, 5 slots could be any order. It could be Ferrari surprising us all third. It could be McLaren third. It could be Aston Martin third. I think that's going to be really interesting, but I think the top 2 are set in stone. It's going to be McLaren or Mercedes, and it's going to be Red Bull.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, well, I don't really have too much to add to that. I just want to, before we go, just remind everybody that the top 5 last year at the Bahrain Grand Prix, which, wasn't very long ago, was only back, the race was only run on November 29th. I mean, literally, it's still fresh in our minds. Anyways, that top 5 was Hamilton, Verstappen, Alex Albon, Lando Norris, and Carlos Sainz. Actually, let's go down top 10. Then we had Gasly, Ricciardo, Bottas finishing in 8th, way down there. I mean, this sometimes boggles my mind. Anyways, then Ocon, and then Charles Leclerc rounding out the top 10. So some of the stats that we have on this one, the race distance is 308 kilometers, 58 laps. Circuit length is 5.41 kilometers, and the lap record was set by Pedro de la Rosa way back in 2005, a lap record of 131.447. So Pirelli's kind of, they're bringing their sort of, middle of the range compounds. We've got the C2 hard, C3 mediums, and the C4 softs. And it's I'm looking forward to it. Let's just put it that way. It's interesting too, if you look at some of the stats here, just over the number of times that this race has been held. As I said, it's been held 16 years now. Way back in 2004 is the first time. Split 50-50 between Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton. They've both won there 4 times. Ferrari's won there the most. They've got 6 wins. And the fastest lap of the last year's race was a 132.014. and that was set by Max Verstappen. So still quite a little bit off the pace, more than half a second to Pedro's lap record way back in 2005. That seems like that needs to be broken. That seems like one that's been standing for a little bit too long.
Not to sound like a total loser, but one of the things I love about this race, and it's funny too, because when they first started racing here, it was a day race, and they ultimately moved it to a night race.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I love is they have these small mini twinkle LED lights wrapped around all the palm trees. And at night, they just kind of sparkle in the background. And when you see a photo of a car at night, they've got this big, beautiful bokeh. So we have this tiny baby 2-foot palm tree at the front of our house. And we've tried to emulate what they do in Bahrain. So we've got these little white LEDs wrapped around it. I'm sure nobody in the world would ever figure out that's what we're trying to do, but that's how much I like the track, that I'm trying to replicate the look and feel of the Bahrain racetrack in our front yard.
So do you also have the fireworks that kind of go off in sequence when you pull in out of your driveway when you come home at night from work? You got the fireworks going off, because that would be pretty cool.
If we did, you lived close enough that you would have seen them. So.
That's right. I'll have to keep a lookout whenever you're driving in from
Totally.
a long day at the office. Anyways, Mark, I think that's all we got for this week.
Sign out at hour 9.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that we've proven since we started doing the show together, a number of months ago, that there is certainly no danger of not having enough to talk about between the two of us. And well, we're leaving it in a great spot. It's finally here, the start of the season. I mean, we've been pumped up and really amped about it for a good number of weeks now. And I know when we started recording this show that free practice was still many, many hours away. Free practice is probably over by now, the way that we've rambled on. But
Jeez.
I'm just kidding, of course. But anyways, I will leave it there. I am starting to ramble, speaking of. Anyways, if you guys want to get in touch, by all means, send us an email, scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. Get in touch on Twitter at scuderiaf1pod. And that's it. That's a wrap. Enjoy the race. We'll be back Sunday night to recap it. And until then, enjoy your weekend. We'll talk soon. Bye for now.